All right. Welcome everyone to the third session of Quakerism 101, so we're following the chapters, of Rex Ambler's The Quaker Path, and the third chapter is called Meeting Others, and so it deals with the topics of community and then with corporate worship, worship together, why that's important. I was thinking today we'd sort of start with a little bit of sort of more personal reflections on community, then do a little bit of history, very little bit, and as well as some information about the basic sort of structures of Quaker community, especially at Friends Meeting of Austin, the various sort of quarterly, yearly, monthly meetings, committees, membership, all these sort of things that sort of help our community function. And then we'll sort of end with a little bit deeper reflection into corporate worship and what it means to meet together in that way. So I guess I'd like to start with a query for everyone about your experiences with community. So what communities have you been a part of in your life? And what was it like to be part of those communities?
Yes.
If you wouldn't mind getting a little bit closer to the speaker, that'd be great.
Growing up in the Baptist church, and religiously speaking, I don't know, progressively I've had various different experiences over the years, I guess, with community, and good and bad. And it's interesting because in the Quaker community, not having a minister and it being very democratic and also very spiritual in a sense, being open to something that's greater and grander, and but not necessarily a lot of dogma around that. And I used to refer to, and I don't want to like poo-poo too much, other religious communities or whatever, but I just know from my own experiences growing up, I'd call it warehouse religion or whatever, this kind of stripped down, but also putting a lot of emphasis on the minister and the Bible. And so I saw these communities where people would either almost worship the minister or they hated his guts, one or the other. And they would go behind their back to stab him in the back and get rid of them. And I saw that over and over growing up in the church that I grew up in. And then, somewhere along the way when I was in college, I decided to start going to the Episcopalian church, and I fell in love with all the, is some kind of, speak of it, the smells and bells and bowing before something that's greater than yourself and taking in the fruits of the earth and all of that. But then I just couldn't swallow the creeds. But I also loved, like St. David's used to have this beautiful, and I've been since then and it's just not the same, but back in the 80s, I would go to this folk mass they'd have in the evening, and they'd have all these people playing guitar, like a whole string of people playing guitar, and a flautist playing flute, and just a pianist. And it was just, all the prayers were sung. It was just gorgeous. And it would put you in this state of mind that was just really incredible. But they haven't, I don't think they've had that in years, but But yeah, that's some of the things that come to mind when it comes, when being in a religious community, for me personally, in my experiences.
Although I didn't grow up in a religious community, as I said before, I feel like I grew up in a really strong community, though. My parents teach at University of California, Irvine, and the university has this neighborhood that it's all the staff and faculty of the university live right there in that neighborhood, pretty much. I just grew up with my parents' friends, and it was a sort of community they just eat dinner together like multiple times a week. It felt like it was just sort of constant dinner parties, and like you could just show up at people's houses, and it feels like we always have each other's cars and stuff. Like someone doesn't need it, and then it takes it, and it was really. I feel like that's sort of my inner working model of community. Is that kind of really group of friends who look after each other's kids, and it's something I've sort of really wanted, or what I sort of envisioned as an adult now, what it would be like to be part of that. And yeah, somehow it's hard to, I don't know if it's a different time or a different place, but it's hard to find that sort of ease and just almost sort of living together quality. I guess probably the most important communities in my life now, one is the ballet company that I dance for Ballet Austin, and as dancers we're very, very physically close to each other. We're constantly touching each other, and just very, very, we have to rely on each other in a very intensely direct way. Like you're literally catching someone out of the air, and so you have to like know that they'll be there, they'll catch you, and that you can rely on them. And it's very beautiful and very powerful, and I feel that community really deeply, and I try to support that as much as I can. And it makes it painful though. I sometimes want it to be a community sort of almost like this, where we're all together, we're all here, we're all accepted into it, and it is like that to an extent. But then people get let go sometimes, and that's I think a difference with it's not like that's just, it's work and it's a job, and it doesn't have the same quality of just being a community for its own sake. It's something that is there, but that it's also serving this purpose of performing, and sometimes, yeah, it's painful when that happens. And yeah, and being part of here, I think has also, yeah, I guess we'll probably talk a little bit more about all the committees and structures and stuff of FMA, but this is sort of, I think, my other community at the moment.
I feel like I left out, there was this Bible study I was involved with in an Episcopalian church as well. And it was so cool because we were all different ages, different socioeconomic backgrounds. And we would get off topic and start talking about Plato and philosophy sometimes. And it was just a kind of neat experience to be involved with a group that was so diverse, but you know.
One of the communities, I could come up there. Thank you. One of the communities I participate in now is a group of women who've been having retreats every 6 months for 32 years. I haven't been to all of them. I wasn't even here for like the first 3 years of it. But it's like, this is a community, no matter who of the 40 people on the list who show up. There were 10 of us this last time, and we have a fine time. And partly it's because we had that memory together. And partly it's because we have self-selected. We're interested in the same kind of activities.
Keep waiting for someone online to say something, but I'll go here. So, as I think all of you are aware, or mentioned at some point, I was brought up in the family of a United Methodist pastor in a very isolated, conservative rural areas of the upper Midwest. And I don't think about, I wasn't thinking about it then, but it was community. My experience with it was not, looking back at it, was not actually positive. I remember talking with my sister and I talk a lot. We talk for hours at a time, several times a month, on the phone. And we got into talking about how she and our other siblings have a lot of the personality traits of repressed people, and how our parents were actually pretty good about how they raised us, even to the point where they believed in free will. So if the kids didn't want to go to church, they didn't go to church, even though my dad was the pastor. I mean, they were, that was pretty progressive, I guess. But I said, so what was that? And Betty said, well, the entire community we lived in were the ones that were repressing us, because they had these expectations of us because of where we were supposed to fit in the community. And I now have retrieved memories where, I was really petrified of doing something that would, speaking to the idea of, this backstabbing and stuff like that. I was aware of this enough at an early age that I was terrified of doing something that would put my parents in a bad light. So I repressed myself a lot as a kid. And so when I got to be 18 and, went off to college, I was out of there. I didn't realize I was out of there, but then after about a few weeks, I realized I was out of there. And and pretty much didn't do anything, to retrieve, because I didn't have a real positive model, I don't think, to retrieve anything until I walked into Quaker meeting about when I was about 47, and started to get some sense that there could be a community. And I got to tell you, Gelia, who's was one of the first people I talked to when I came to Quaker meeting. We didn't get together for a few more years, but she was brought up in Church of Christ, which is, of course, they're very close knit, community oriented, and she has carried over her habits of really trying to connect with people, into that. So I get to see that be around. So I appreciate that. One of the things we've done in our married life, we got this 1 acre property on the outskirts of Austin, and we've been trying to garden it up, turn it into something, and with the vague idea that somehow there will be a community around that someday. We don't know how, but someday there will. So, and we don't know how that would even happen. or exactly what that would look like, but that's kind of a thought we have. I'll tell you a childhood story about. I remember one of the things we would get invited a lot to eat out at people's houses, partly because they didn't pay my dad a lot, and that was actually part of. I mean, it wasn't just to be nice and social. It was actually to help us out, and so apparently at some point I had said something inopportune about the food or something like that. And so I remember my parents telling me, look, next time, you can always find something good to say. You don't have to lie, but just figure out what the good thing was to say about it. And I remember taking that very to heart. So the next time we go there, and sure enough, they have all my favorite food. It's all done perfectly. I was just so thrilled by what they did. So I'm about 5, so trying to be witty, at the age of 5, I said, thank you so much. It was so much better than we expected. And I suppose I remember that. I don't remember what happened after that, but something fairly consequential must have happened after I said that, because I still remember that. So anyway, just throw that out.
This is more of a query I just want to throw out. What, living in the age that we do and with COVID, this last few years, how has that affected the community and how we relate to one another? And also just in general before COVID, I mean, the more we go technology increases, we connect through our phones and computers, and so what does that mean for us as a culture?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a wonderful query. Would you mind if we return to that query a little bit later, just in case anyone else has sort of more experiences from their past life that they'd like to share at this point?
Yeah, I was just throwing that out there, not necessarily to get an answer, but as something to think
about. So I guess I don't have a ton of experience with community. I grew up on a ranch out in West Texas. My parents pulled me out of school at a pretty young age. So most of my life was just kind of being alone out there on that ranch. We lived about a 20-minute drive away from the closest actual town. And so when I went to high school there, I actually became kind of a part of that smaller town community. I don't know, I guess things were pretty difficult, going to high school kind of out in West Texas, because things weren't the most accepting. I was treated pretty different from other students by teachers and just people in the community. So I think the small town environment where everybody knows your business and they all know your family, I think that can be great for some people, but I mean, for me personally, it was kind of a difficult experience growing up in that kind of environment. So I haven't had a ton of, I don't know, good experiences with community. I think back to the COVID thing, just in college, it's also been very difficult to relate and to connect with other people. So I think it's a challenge.
I guess, and feel free if you have further reflections or memories that you'd like to share about sort of your experiences with community, feel free to share those. But sort of moving on, I guess, to another query. I guess we can incorporate this. The query was just asked about what it's like, what your experience of community during these last 2 years when we've been living with COVID has been. And then a different query, but I think also important. What do you hope for from a community?
I don't want to keep talking because I feel like, but I had two other memories that came to mind as far as community is concerned that were very joyful and happy. One was working at Texas Lions Camp for handicapped children. And I worked there 2 summers, and they were 2 of the best summers of my life. And I was in there working with a bunch of young people that weren't in college, most of us, and just working a summer job. But we had to actively like be creative and come up with fun activities for these kids. And you were just helping, kids that, had physical, disabilities and issues that and so you had to step up and be there for them in ways they couldn't be there for themselves. But again, making it fun. And then when we had a night off, we go as adults and do silly, crazy things like go down to the river and skinny dip and whatever, it was just, and that was such a joyful experience. And I wish that I don't know, there's a part of me that wishes I could live like that all the time, but it was kind of a mountaintop experience. And then now working at the IRS, being federal government, they're pretty good about hiring people of so many various backgrounds, disabilities and abilities and whatnot. So you see people that from so many diverse backgrounds, and it's fun and interesting. I mean, there's several Muslim women that sit around me, and I wish, we're so busy just working and focusing on the work, but we do interact and become friendly with one another too. So it's been interesting, but just being around, people of so many various, backgrounds and abilities and disabilities and age differences and whatnot, and that accepting nature of, and then actually working together, so how do we, I don't know, how can we make that happen more?
Well, it's taken me a long time to figure out what I expect from a community, but what I've learned is that I expect a community to be a place where I can be of service. However, that requires that the community provide me with the wherewithal to be of service. So it's like breathing in and out. I want to be of service, but I need a community that will help me be of service.
Mm. The other thing about working at Texas Lions Camp is that we worked so closely together, and it was such a, emotionally high experience that those people that I made connections, Delia was one of them, with years later, we can not have seen each other for 10 years, and then we get together and it's like yesterday, that bond is so strong that time and distance.
Yeah, I hadn't been thinking about that much. What Larry just said really spoke to me about being able to be of service, or being what it means to be sort of a valued part of a community. I think, yeah, what feels really meaningful to me here is that I can be so much a part of what happens, and express ideas and leadings and thoughts, and that people respond to them, and things happen. We get together and we sort of support each other's strengths and interested, and try to help each other where we have weaknesses. And that's been a really beautiful experience. And it doesn't always work perfectly, but I think there's that glimmer of that ideal in everything, I feel like, here. So that is sort of what I hope for.
I'd go along with what's been said, James, Larry, and Daniel, about what I expect from a community. But and I think there was one word that I heard James say about that maybe is unique to a Quaker community, or maybe something we think about more in Quaker community, which is a place where it is safe for me to test my leadings, or the what I think are the messages or the leadings or the concerns that come to me, and that's a valuable thing to me. I haven't had to do that very much, but I know it's available, and in fact, I've done that, and Kelly and I together have done that. Actually having someone besides yourself to do that with is very valuable to me, and I think is not unique to, but fairly special to a Quaker community.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Howard, for pointing that out. I realized just now that, I used kind of a special Quaker word almost without, I feel like that would be a good, in Quakerism 101, something that we should definitely, explain and talk about this word. Leading is really a part of the Friends tradition. And as those who've been here longer might correct me, but I think, as I understand it, it's that you feel called, you feel led to do something, usually to take some sort of action, usually sort of an action that will be, you feel will be beneficial to the world, or some act of service. And you then, that's something that you feel called to individually, but then that what Howard was talking about, you can take that to the meeting and ask for people to both sit with you and reflect on that. Sometimes you might be, it might not be a good leading, that's a possibility. And we'll hopefully, but for the most part, I think there's a lot of the meeting will support and try to help and try to sort of deepen what it is that you feel called to do. And that's an important part of how this works.
Are we going to speak any on and I can't think of the terminology now, like if you as an individual are searching and have an issue, you can go to
Clearness Committee.
clearness committees.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I've never personally, as an individual, been involved in one of those, but I hear them talked about.
It can be very useful. I read a novel that had Quakers in it, and supposedly these Quakers in France talked about it as a committee of clarity. Now, whether or not that's a real translation, but it was a helpful distinction for me. The clearness is, should I go to grad school or should I start a job? That may be something I want other people to help me decide about, or it might have been some years back. But we suggest a clearness committee for specific things, like if a couple wish to be married under the care of the meeting. But also it can be about a personal decision you want to make. It could be about a specific leading. I think I should go to the Ukraine. Let's talk about that before you decide to go to the Ukraine.
And if I discern to go somewhere or somewhere else, do I go with the explicit support of my meeting?
Right.
That is, will the meeting write a traveling minute for me and as kind of an introduction? That's the next step. Next step beyond that.
It could have more implications for the meeting, like, are you prepared to financially help do this?
Or is this something that turns into a general concern of the meeting?
Do all of us want to know about that?
Well, like a person is led, let's say years ago, a person was led to visit people on death row.
Right.
Now that's a major part of how the meeting sees itself, as being involved in this action, so that I don't know the exact personal history of that because it was a little bit before I was here, but I assume it started with an individual or two. I don't know. You probably know more about that, Mary.
There was a group who were part of visiting a federal prison in Bastrop. And then I think Glenna may have been the first one to go to death row, but I'm not sure of that. And Jude.
Oh, Glenna's mute. I think she's trying to say something.
I was the first one from the meeting in Austin to go to death row. Jude lived in Dallas for a while, and she had been going longer than I had, but I didn't know her until she moved to Austin and became part of the meeting. But when we got an invitation to be part of the chaplains program at Bastrop Federal Correctional Institution, it was so amazing. I mean, I didn't know anyone that was in prison, but it just really called to me. It's a place I like to be. So, bit by bit, more and more people started going. Genevieve gave me rides for probably a year to get there. And it was just the two of us in the car, her car. I didn't have a vehicle. So I'm up for going with somebody that I don't even have a visit, for company sometimes. People never take me up on it, but not for that. But anyway, let me let that go. Thanks.
I was gonna just, I think we touched on it briefly before, but you think it's appropriate to mention kind of historical examples?
Yeah, I was just about to
Oh,
go
okay,
into a historical interlude.
You go ahead.
So
You go ahead.
yeah,
Go ahead.
and of course, if people have further personal sort of stories and memories and hopes that they want to share, feel free to interject. So I guess sort of talking about, we've talked a little bit about the first session, especially about the very early Quaker community, the sort of kind of chaotic, very energetic, very expansive period during the English Civil War. And during that time, as I understand it, their hope was really that Quakerism, they thought this really was the second coming and that this was sort of the inward coming of Christ, and that this Quaker, this sort of inward revelation and this sort of Quaker practice would really become the global church, the global religion. And they sent out, emissaries to speak to, or people to speak to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and to the Pope. And interesting stories there. I guess actually the conversation with the Ottoman Sultan was actually quite surprisingly nice, I think. There was a woman there, he was sort of, I think, just somewhat bemused to have her come and try to convert him to Quakerism. But he was very happy to just sort of like, oh, okay, this English woman has shown up and wants to talk to you. Okay. I think, as I understand it, the conversation with the Pope did not go as well. I don't think that might have happened at all. But so after the English Civil War, though, and things start to sort of quiet down, Quakerism is sort of quite actively persecuted in those first few years, especially after the restoration of the monarchy. In the period thereafter, it really does start to become clear that Quakerism isn't going to be the global religion, that it's not going to overthrow all the existing churches and replace them with this sort of inward. So then the question becomes, so then what are we? What are we doing? If it's not that we're going to sort of convert the world to Quakerism and become the new world order, what is it? And so they sort of, there's this shift to seeing Quakers as sort of peculiar people, of being in the world but not of it. And it's during this time that the community starts to take some changes that I think were good and beneficial and that we still have, and then some that I think made it kind of insular for a while. So this is sort of the period when Quakers begin to adopt plain dress and plain speech. So I guess if you're familiar with like the Quaker Oats guy all dressed in gray, that Quakers really were supposed to dress in gray and not use sort of dyed clothes. They also started to speak in a different way. It was around this time that English was starting to undergo a transformation where we were losing the thou form. So it used to be interesting, well, grammatical digression. So it used to be that English was kind of like French or Spanish, where you had two forms of the second person pronoun. So you had a thou and a you. So like in French, you'd use tu for a singular other person who you were not being, who you sort of knew informally, and you'd use vous for a group of people or for someone that you were speaking to as a in a respectful way. And so English used to be like that you had thou for people, for singular people, and you for respect for a group or for someone who you're speaking to in a respectful way. But what started to happen was that we started to lose the thou form. So it just shifted to you. And so because I guess it was kind of convenient. I mean, I guess it sort of happens in French too. You want to be polite to people, so you probably default to the vous form. So that's just, and it started to become that you basically were calling everyone you in English, and now we've lost the thou form completely. But Quakers resisted this change. They thought that referring to singular people with the plural pronoun was dishonest or was distortion, that it was putting on airs. It was kind of like, they also rejected, there was this elaborate hat honor that was a big deal in the 1600s, and Quakers refused to do that. They refused to call singular people you. And so I even hear up until the 20th century, you'd still probably have friends that would sometimes use thou art, and then all the verb conjugations that you'd use with thou. So that's sort of, if you've ever heard of that, or if you see accounts of Quakers in older books or older history, it's that that's what's going on. That's why they're using the thou form there. It's a sort of rejection of linguistic change. And so, but part of the result of that, and there's sort of an irony here, and that's something that came very deeply from a sense of wanting to come from individual leadings and to reject the outward sort of forms and trappings and markers of religion that they found empty, became then very, very marked by these very distinct outward forms. So Quakers became very easily identifiable on the basis of their plain dress, and also the fact that they wouldn't use the hat ritual, the sort of hat greetings of the time, and would continue to use thou as opposed to you. Quakers also were sort of separated in a lot of ways because they refused to take vows, which put them out of running for a lot of public office, both in England and the United States. Taking vows was a very important part of establishing that someone is trustworthy or that someone is going to do what they're going to do. And like some of the institutions of government and the rituals of it don't really work if you aren't willing to swear an oath. And in America, we've come to more workarounds for that. So there are now ways if you are at the witness stand.
Right. I've veiled myself.
You have? Oh my goodness. Okay, well that's great. We've actually can you tell us what that was like?
Well, you just say I have a stop of conscience. You just tell the clerk court, I have a stop of conscience against taking of oaths in public, in public spaces, and they just have a little thing, and they they swear all the people who are going to be jurors in. Well, they take you off to the side. Just have you say, yes, I affirm that I'm a good person, and back, and you don't swear the oath, also should point out, Quakers were pretty influential in the early days of the United States. Pennsylvania was still pretty Quaker, and it was an important part of the U.S., and there were other places. And so you'll notice there's actually an acknowledgement of this very, very underhanded in the U.S. Constitution. They actually give the form of the oath of office that the president takes, and they give the text of it, and the Constitution says, "I do solemnly swear or affirm." That I will, do, and that was in deference to the Quakers, in case, which did actually happen with Herbert Hoover. I think Herbert Hoover. I think Herbert. Well, next I don't know. Herbert Hoover, I believe, did say affirm instead of so. Yeah. I was looking for Margaret Fell's comment.
Oh, the small petty gospel or something.
It was silly. She said,
silly gospel.
Yeah, she said, Margaret Fell, who is, most of us know, but just for those of us listening on a recording or something, Margaret Fell was if George Fox was kind of the founding father of Quakerism, Margaret Fell was the founding mother. She and her first husband were very, very active in protecting Quakers. He was a judge, an important person in Northwest England, protecting Quakers and pushing the Quaker message. And then some years after her husband died, she and George Fox actually married. And she's always been considered kind of a voice, one of the principal voices of the first Quakers. But she lived a lot longer. She lived into the 1700s. And she was appalled by the stuff that Quakers were starting to do, like, put all these rules on things. And she has this rant on dressing. She said, come on, you want to wear some nice colors and some ribbons. What's the problem with that? And she actually has this phrase that's become very. She says that the idea of plain dresses, that is a silly, poor gospel. Wow. So anyway, there was some pushback on this. Just so you know.
What about more recently with Quakers being? I remember I had the pleasure of being involved in I guess Southwest yearly meeting or whatever last year that was online, and attending some of the meetings and some of the groups and speaking. And there were these groups of Quakers that were like earth justice, and then there's that whole aspect of social justice and and nonviolent action that's become a part of, you know, Quakerism, I guess, you know, or a brand or sub, you know, it's something that they've become involved in more and more. And I don't know, it was interesting that the one group was like a social justice, an earth justice sort of thing. And they were going to like this bank or banks and like making a stand, you know, and having these sit-ins and, but getting very creative in almost a fun way sometimes with some of this stuff, and kind of speaking truth to power, that kind of thing.
That's great. Yeah, we'll be sure to come this. So that this, I think it's our last session will be all about the action and social witness.
Okay.
And that's a huge part of the Quaker tradition. So that's and going back even from the beginning. So that's an absolutely very important. I think, let's see, that will be it'll be the last one in May, whenever that one is. So like the fourth weekend, fourth Sunday in May.
Okay.
That topic. Yeah. So I guess sort of what then I feel like happens here is because Quakers are very much sort of in some ways forced to be apart from society because they're not permitted, especially in Britain, to participate in a lot of the professions. They kind of, I guess it was only in 1870 actually that all of the full restrictions on them were removed in terms of university and professions in England. And also sort of in a lot of times self-imposed that their separation from the rest of the world. For a long time, Quakers were barred from intermarrying just by the community. So if you were to marry a non-Quaker, you would often be read out of meeting for that. It was very, so it was interesting. I feel like this isn't in the chapter by Rex Ambler, but I thought this was an interesting contrast to what Quakers are now. That what a Quaker community was then was something much more similar to, I feel like almost like an ethnic group or a group that's bonded by strong markers of its identity and by, and also very, very strongly inherited, that the children would often be raised within a Quaker community. They'd grow up saying thou, they'd, learn the special clothes, wear the special clothes of the Quakers, and that it was therefore the sort of, a whole different experience, I can imagine, back then of what it was like to be part of a Quaker meeting. And there are tiny remnants of that now in terms of, I don't know, I've never met anyone who actually would unselfconsciously use thou or would do plain dress. I'm not sure if there are any Quaker communities. You guys,
and there are a few people. I have met a couple at like at gatherings, at national, international meeting. Occasionally there's a person or two who.
This meeting had a very colorful member who had come to Quakerism later in life and decided to use plain speech.
Oh, well.
Yes, just so you know, there are.
Polly.
Yeah, Polly. There are people like that.
Would he just do that at meeting, or would he do that?
Oh, no, all the time.
Okay, all right.
He would do it.
Okay.
And quite the character.
I heard, I think it was somebody that was online here talking about the hat thing, and I was like, oh, that's cool, because I love to wear hats. I wear hats to work all the time, and everybody comments on, oh, you got all these different hats. And I thought it was so neat that, I remember growing up, you take off your hat when you're indoors. It's just a sign of respect. And so ever since then, I was like, okay, I'm gonna wear my hat to the meeting and not worry about it. That's one little thing. But it's interesting, you were talking about this. It seems like there are much more, there was an exclusivity or something, almost like the Amish or something like that. Where
I've been told, though, that being read out of meeting didn't necessarily mean you couldn't attend. It meant you couldn't be part of the business meeting.
Oh, you couldn't vote or whatever.
You could, yeah. You weren't part of the decision making, but you weren't. You weren't fully shunned or anything like that.
Right.
There is a member of the FCNL advocacy group in Austin who says that her grandfather was a Quaker, but he was read out of meeting for selling moonshine on the
Where did he sell moonshine?
On the courthouse steps.
Oh, okay, got it.
Interesting.
If it had been elsewhere, it might not have. been read out.
It's just been discreet.
You know, Johns Hopkins, after whom, you know, the famous center is named, was a Quaker, and I think their fortune was made in brewing. And I believe they had to formally leave Quakerism over that. I think they were still associated with it, but like you said,
So as you can see, it's a very, and just to reassure those of you who are new here, we don't really, at least in my experience, we don't read people out of meetings. So if we find moonshine and selling it, you'll probably be fine. Larry, yeah.
We're about to have an emergency business meeting to do just that.
Yeah, I guess nowadays it's more if you are doing something that's very threatening or harmful to others, I feel like that would be the or that really betrays some confidentiality. That is that would be sort of. I mean, it is important still. I guess I shouldn't say that because it is important that communities also be safe, and sometimes that means that people can't participate in it because there's too much risk. Very hard. Yeah, that is still a hard thing. I guess there are some other things that connect us to that period of Quakerism, when Quakerism was more of that sort of a little bit more insular as a community. One thing is the structure that we have in our meetings. So I guess back then you'd have monthly, quarterly, and yearly meetings. And these were often based on geography, because people had to travel by foot or by horse. And so you would, Quaker meetings had to be very sort of geographically mindful of who could actually make it to meeting. And so the monthly, quarterly, and yearly doesn't necessarily refer to how much people were worshiping. Worship, I think, as far as I understand, would still, as it is now, be kind of once a week, often Sundays. However, a monthly meeting means that you are meeting once a month for a business. And that will be the topic of our next session of this, is business meeting and how Quakers conduct business. But so this Friends Meeting of Austin is a monthly meeting. We meet once a month for meeting for worship with attention to business, or just business meeting, and usually on the first Sunday of the month. And so that's sort of what defines us as a monthly meeting. And so most of the times when you go into like a Quaker meeting, just like a meeting house, that will be, we would call that a monthly meeting, since probably they're meeting for business about once a month. The other layer was quarterly meeting. So it used to be that, okay, so you had the Quakers and their meeting house usually, and then you'd have sort of a little bit larger geographic area. And that would be the quarterly meeting, and they would get up together once a quarter for business meeting. And we still have that form. I don't think we actually do any business meetings together. I think it's more just sort of,
We do.
Oh, we do, okay.
We do occasionally, yeah. But it's more like once a year, but not every year.
Okay, so biannual / quarterly meeting is we are part of Cielo Grande quarterly meeting, which Howard is actually quite involved in. So correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it includes the largest meetings in that are Friends Meeting of Austin, San Antonio Friends Meeting, Dallas, I think is also in there. And there may also be Friends in the Hill Country, I think.
Hill Country and Coastal Bend, which is Corpus Christi.
Oh, Corpus Christi, okay.
Were you going to say something, Glenna?
No, I was agreeing on Corpus
And
Christi.
then you know, just as anyone can show up at a monthly meeting. So for instance, we typically also, there's a Fort Worth meeting that isn't affiliated with a quarterly meeting, but we always invite them, and a few of them show up to the quarterly activities. Yeah, and elsewhere if they wanted to. Lubbock might, there's a unaffiliated Lubbock meeting as well.
So, and then is the yearly meeting even a bigger geographical area and as well as
Our
a longer
yearly
time?
meeting includes Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and a little bit of Missouri, I think.
Not anymore because they. I
No,
think that-
okay, forget the
Oh,
Missouri.
okay.
And Texas,
And Texas.
And Texas, yeah,
except for the El Paso. meeting.
except for El Paso, which goes
Part of a different.
far west.
So it's a big area.
And that will actually be happening. That you may have heard the announcement at the end of meeting. The yearly meeting will be occurring next weekend.
Actually, the
and
first
now
activity starts this evening.
Okay.
There's some online
Stuff
activities.
starts today, yeah.
Yeah, there's some online activities that start, and then the in-person activities start on Thursday and run through Sunday. It's always Easter weekend. Yeah.
And the yearly meeting, in addition to being a way for people to come together and meet one another, typically it'll be the yearly meetings that publish a book called Faith and Practice, which is a just sort of a guide to what we're doing. So if we have questions about, oh, so what is the Quaker practice regarding marriage or a Clearness Committee, or, you know, terrible that we do need to think about reading someone at a meeting, what is good order and good process there. It's not a law book in the sense that we still feel like we are guided by the Spirit. However, it's helpful to know how Quakers have been led and what the sort of practices that have come about from years of reflection are.
It could be seen as more of a descriptive book. You know, because there isn't a hierarchy amongst the meetings in the sense that the yearly meeting tells the quarterly meeting what to do, and the quarterly meeting tells them what to do.
There are a number of different versions of this because many yearly meetings have written one. And some of them have rewritten them 3 or 4 times by now. Our library has a nice collection. And Britain yearly meeting, Philadelphia yearly meeting, some of them are really great readings because they also include a lot of quotations and stuff about any particular issue.
But then aren't there, even religiously, I've heard this meeting is called a universalist, or kind of less Christian or more diverse in the sense of there's spiritual. I mean, you don't have to be a Christian to be a part of the meeting. And then there are other meeting houses where they're much more Christian in nature. Or
There's, in the hallway out there, there's this complicated tree thing just as you go in the library. And they're like 100,
Perfect.
many
Version.
Quaker branches of Quakers.
Yeah.
And some of them are more Protestant and more Christian, and some of them do look, their meetings look more like Protestant church services. What he's describing is an unprogrammed meeting, which is what we are.
Yeah.
I'd encourage you to watch. So the last session we went into, we brought out the tree and we showed it to the screen and stuff.
I'll show you.
It's worth looking
Yeah, we
at.
can show it to you in a little break here. That's
In the United States, there's the 3 branches of Quakerism. There's General Conference, which we're under the umbrella of. And there are Friends United meetings, which are actually churches. And they're mostly in Indiana, Ohio, places like that. And then there are the evangelicals, which mostly are on the West Coast. And Nixon was an evangelical.
And then the evangelicals are the most common outside of Britain and the United States, outside of the English-speaking countries.
Because they're the ones who sent out missionaries.
Yeah.
After people stopped sending them to the Grand Duke, Grand Turk, or whatever.
Yeah. So the largest Quaker community in the world is in East Africa.
Really?
And it's an evangelical.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of the structures that we're describing, so South Central yearly meeting, the yearly meeting we're part of, it doesn't, as far as I know, it does not include any of the programmed. Does not include any of the programmed
That's fine.
meetings or the evangelical meetings that there are in Texas and this geographic region. There are sort of, I think, a separate structure of yearly meetings. As far as I understand, these structures are used also by other branches of Quakerism, that they have sort of a separate set of yearly meetings, and I'm not sure quarterly meetings and monthly meetings as well. So that's sort of they're sort of overlapping geographic areas of Quakers. And if you want to look, the faith and practice that we use here, South Central Yearly Meeting has been thinking about and
Been working
on a year faith and practice. However, since that has not been published, we have been using North Pacific Yearly Meetings, Faith and Practice, which is available entirely online. If you want to see that, there's also a bunch of copies here at the meeting house.
And we will refer to the faith and practice, which are also in some, by some Quakers called, in some meeting called the Book of Discipline, by the way. But we will refer to it, you know, for guidance. Like, for instance, I know sometimes the question comes up, oh, do you have to be a member to be on this committee? And we'll look it up and see what, you know, what does the faith and practice say? You know, do you have to be a member to be on? For instance, anyone can be on any committee in the meeting, with the exception, I think, and we'll have to check, of the Care and Counsel committee and maybe the Worship and Ministry committee, but I'm not sure about that. But that would be in the faith and practice, and we would be advised by what was in the faith and practice, but you know,
Constrained.
we can.
It's like the Pirates of the Caribbean. Faith and practice is more of a guideline than rules.
Well,
There you go.
And there's a good reason for that. Just like the pirates were an anarchy, the Quakers are one of the most successful anarchies that
That's true. That's true. I like that.
The clerks have to be members according to our discipline,
But of course,
including,
our meeting has decided not to follow that, and then Erica is not a member.
Yeah,
Right,
so
right.
actually,
oh, really?
we made an exception for Erica, and maybe somebody before her too.
I
But
think maybe-
we consciously knew that we were making that decision. She's been an attender for many years. So you would think she was a member.
actually, I was wondering if this might be a good time. We're about an hour, just a little bit over an hour in. If we maybe want to take a little bit of a break, and then I think actually the topic of membership is something really interesting and something that, as you can maybe gather from right now, has been a topic of great discussion and curiosity here. So yeah, we can talk about that a little bit more just a minute. Cool. So maybe about 5 minutes or so. I'll come back.
Okay.
Kind of near it.
No, I would say like the closest like San Angelo or.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it's like a 20-minute drive. The ranch that I grew up on.
Yeah. I'm almost from Albany,
Okay.
so not that far away.
Yeah.
well, my mom was from Robin.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
My name's there. Zaid?
Yes.
All right, nice to meet you, Zaid. And if you're considering talking to my wife about yoga, you could reach her this way.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I figure I could always call your phone and say, hey, I'm Diane, but this is a good system.
She may not be available.
This might be a better system, yes.
Now,
As I
if you
said-
call her and she doesn't answer, she's not available.
Does she listen to messages?
Oh, yeah, she does this.
Okay, so in that case, I would leave her a message.
Yeah, she's not. Yeah, a lot of young folks don't listen to the voicemail anymore, I noticed.
And some older folks, there are a lot of people I know. My brother and Mary Lee and Gary all fill up their message box and don't never have to. And then you can't leave a message. It does not,
That's because they have other things to do.
that must be it.
I mean, Hicks, that's the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that may be the case for my brother as well.
What do you live in Austin?
I don't live in Austin, I live in San Marcos, actually.
Oh,
I've been there for, I guess, 3 years now. So I'm in college at Texas State.
Oh.
So that's why I'm in the area,
may I ask what you're studying?
art history.
What do you plan to do next?
I mean, anything I can do that's related to my major. I like all the job prospects. So like I do something in a gallery or curatorial work, or I could write like, in an academic sense, or museums. Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna spread my net out and see what it catches. But yeah,
What you're thinking about, that's good.
yeah. I mean, I'm trying to land like a few internships. I've had one already, and I have a job teaching assistant right now. But I'm just trying to get more experience in different levels that relate to it. So I'm applying to a gallery soon, so I can start getting more experience while I'm in college. Yeah, so that's the plan. So what do you do?
Oh, I'm retired and I wrote software for 30 years.
Wow.
And then after I graduated from working, I decided I would like to do some writing that required fewer semicolons. So I've written a collection of short stories and a novel. But I discovered that when I encounter impediments, it usually means I'm not supposed to know that. It's like I'm being channeled somewhere else. So I had a literary assistant who was helping me with my novel. She required to develop all that through the copy editor. But they were both just terrible. Well, that's an exaggeration. They weren't people. Like the copy editor, one of the names of my churches in the book was the All Welcome Protestant Church of Ladrones. She wanted to put a comma after all welcome. So, and also because of Mary, one of the characters who was born around 1870 said at one point, "God willing, and the creek don't rise."
Oh, yeah.
And I had capitalized Creek because of the Creek Indians. But my copy editor did it lowercase. So I complained about that. And she didn't mark it. And I complained about this. And the literary assistant said, well, she did thorough research and she could find no instance where in that epigram, Creek referred to the Indians. So it couldn't have been the Creek Indians.
Well,
And I thought, well, wait a minute, this is work of fiction, Dan. Right, anyways, I complained about all this and she fired me.
Oh,
So now I have to figure out how to publish the novel. And I figured, oh, here again, I'm being diverted from that path. I wonder where the path lies. So that's what I'm doing. I'm complaining. That's what I'm doing.
pretty close to being retired, yes.
Yes.
You have so much time for many things.
Yeah.
Many complaints.
I've often wondered, when I was great, who am I? What am I doing? Now I know I'm a curmudgeon.
Are you talking about your editor, Margaret?
What?
Are you talking about your editors?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Persistent.
Hi, James. Do we not have the names under the pictures anymore when people have their picture up?
Oh,
I always found that very helpful because there are people whose names I can never remember.
yeah.
You know,
I don't
and,
know.
when I'm at home, I don't get the names either. I think we must have switched them off somewhere.
If I put the mouse, it shows them clearly. I wonder.
Huh.
That's weird.
I was noticing that today because one of the things I've appreciated of having our COVID time is I've learned more people's names.
Yeah, you can see it on the
I can
screen,
read it on the screen.
right?
There you go. There you go.
So I guess, has it been about 5 minutes then?
I think so.
Okay,
So, yeah.
cool. All right. So we might go ahead and get started again. And as you can hear this, I think the topic that was just starting to bubble up there at the last few minutes before we went on break was the question of membership. I guess, and it ties into it, I think, a deeper question of what it means to be part of a Quaker community. What does that look like? What is the, and I think it was Terry who was telling me back in the olden days, sort of earlier when I was talking about membership in a community was very important to establish because there really wasn't much in the way of a government social safety net. There wasn't any government social safety net. And so really, if you fell on hard times, your religious community was kind of responsible for making sure that you were provided for. And that you, and so kind of establishing who's a member of which meeting is important because you kind of need to figure out whose problem it is. If someone has who can you go, and that people aren't abusing the system by going to multiple meetings and sort of asking that there's this sort of, I guess, so meetings, I guess we're very rigorous about keeping membership roles. And that's not the case anymore. I mean, despite the fact, maybe our social safety net isn't everything we'd still want it to be from the government, that we do have support that we offer to people, care and counsel, and this is open, really, this is not open just to members. Really, if you have a need and financially that there's a benevolence fund that helps people, and we no longer really make a clear distinction between members and non-members. The idea of who is part of our community is much more hard to pin down. It's kind of to some extent, and other people probably have thoughts about this, it's a bit of a sort of, we know who's in the community, but there's not a clear definition. Because, and Glenna, I think, was talking about this, there are several people who have been part of our community for years and years and are deeply, deeply central to it, but have chosen not to go through the process of becoming a member. And what the process of becoming a member is you write a letter to Care and Counsel, I believe, or to the meeting, expressing your interest in becoming a member. And the letter can be fairly short. I think mine was maybe a paragraph or two. Some people write much, much longer letters. If that's something that's useful to you, then by all means, you're welcome to write a longer letter or a shorter one, just expressing your intention. And then Care and Counsel will set up a Clearness Committee. And you'll meet several times. I think usually 2 or 3 is common. And just talk about your spiritual journey, what's drawn you to the Quaker meeting, and make sure that there really is a genuine leading there to become part of this meeting, and that you understand what this meeting is, and what Quakerism is, and both sort of how that gives to your life, and also how you can sort of really be a true part of the meeting in terms of contributing your own energy and life, and being there for us. And then after that, the Clearness Committee will write a letter of a recommendation to business meeting. And there will be 2 readings at business meeting, at which point, after the second reading, you would then become a member of the meeting. And I found that process really great. I mean, mostly because of the Clearness Committee. You just have this really great kind of unique opportunity to really sit with a bunch of people, and they'll really listen to you and really try to understand where you're coming from, and why this is important to you, and really help you think about, understand what your relationship to the community is. And so that was really, I think, a valuable thing to me. However, some people feel, I'm not sure I can speak for others, but the idea of joining a group or officially declaring the identity of Quaker is something that they just have never felt personally called to. And yet they're still deeply part of this community. And I think there are a few things that in at least faith and practice are specifically set aside for members. I think worship and ministry and care and counsel committees, as well as the clerkship of the meeting. But even that is something we wrestle with. That isn't entirely clear that that should be exclusively for people who've gone through this membership process, simply because we do know that there are really, really valuable central parts of our community, people in our community who haven't gone through this process.
And then the perennial, well, I don't know perennial, but it happens a lot. Discussion is, then what is membership for? You know, and then we get into that whole, you know, that whole thing. Is it
Right.
Is it for us or is it for the outside world?
That's true. I wonder too, like, I guess back in the day when, and not, hopefully this won't happen again, but when there was conscription and
That was important.
that was important. Like if you're going to be a conscientious objector to show that you're a member of the meeting.
And by the way, conscientious objector status was first brought, formalized in U.S. law in World War I, largely through the efforts of the American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker action arm, which was founded in 1917 precisely in response to the First World War. And they're the ones that got the idea of conscientious objector status started.
But people that aren't necessarily members, and I kind of like this because I was part of the Unitarian Universalist Church for a while, and you couldn't be a voting member. You couldn't vote unless you were a member of the, and there were certain committees and certain things that you couldn't be on. But it seems like here there's a more open-ended.
Very definitely, and we'll get more into that the next time. But we don't vote anyhow.
You don't vote anyway.
Well, and that's the other thing. They used to call it something else, right?
We call it unity now.
And we used to be called
Consensus.
It's like it's the same. It's
Yeah.
consensus.
The reason we don't call it consensus anymore is that's taken on a secular meaning. We don't
Okay.
necessarily.
It's the sense of the meeting.
Sense of the meaning, thank you.
And we have, as Mary was
Yes,
saying, the whole next session.
attenders participate in that. Whoever shows up for business meeting in the first instance participates.
I'll be right back.
The annoying thing is when somebody doesn't show up for business meeting and then says, wait a minute, I think differently.
Well, and speaking of that, I heard that this community has had, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes here, a rather interesting historical, florid, whatever discussion, being the father of a son who's gay, allowing gay people to be a part of the meeting, or actually marriage and that sort of thing.
We have married, somebody once told me we had married 4.5 gay couples, and I said, huh? But yes, we do marry. We take into account and have the same process for a couple applying for marriage. And gay participation has been something very much part of this meeting a long time.
And
Yeah, I just heard that there was a period or time where there was a meeting that actually meeting towards business, that there was like, are we going to allow? And it was probably in the 70s or.
I moved here in '93, and it had already happened. And it
was a big in ours, it was about 30 years ago.
30 years ago. Okay.
And it's about to be 5.5 gay couples married to the care of the meeting. So on October 1st.
Yes, I never understood the person who was explaining to me about the half couple.
That is a mystery, perhaps, if anyone knows. It's some future session. If you're watching online and you know what the story
Oh, I know
is.
what it is.
What was it?
There was a couple who married as male and female, and then the one of the members came out as transgender, and so
Okay, that starts again.
they like to joke, because this was 10 or 12 years ago, so they like to say they got married, as a same-sex couple before it was legal, but they were able to do it anyway. So I mean, we were doing it before it was quote unquote legal, but they actually got a marriage license.
Well, I'd heard from somebody historically this meeting, that when that discussion came up, they had a meeting that attended to business, and some Quakers that hadn't been attending
That's right.
for a long period of time showed up, and they were like, we're not for this. And then the clerk or whoever it was said, look, you don't have a say in this because you haven't been to meeting
In a long time.
in a long time. And so,
That was Paul. That was Paul Stuckey, who was clerk.
Oh, bless his heart.
And
Paul
he-
Stuckey, you know, that's in Columbia now. He
he
said,
literally spoke up and said,
sorry, you guys haven't been a part of this community for a while. You can't just show up.
Okay, I don't think that happened in
You
Austin.
don't?
No,
Okay.
I heard it somewhere near Baltimore that it happened. And so many of the meetings had books that we would read, and we would have discussions, and we would want everybody to come. We did have some people that weren't part of that, and they did express that in a business meeting, and we put it off a bit. And anyway, ultimately it worked out, and they were married. I was involved in that. I wasn't one of the persons that got married. I was on the Clearness Committee. But the one I heard about was on the East Coast. And they had a person, a member of their meeting who was elderly and was really well respected and was responsible. But when this topic came up, he didn't attend any of the sessions. He didn't read the books. And he just showed up at meeting for business and said he opposed it, or I don't know what the words were, but the clerk said, you do not have enough weight on this issue. And they went ahead and approved it. And the man who was trying to stop it understood, and he accepted it. So that was really good to hear about.
You're saying something, Larry?
Yes, I was going to say the meeting that Paul Stuckey was clerk for, Magdalene Berger, who was no longer with us, got up and said that she didn't think that Ethel Barrow would approve of it.
Who was a founding member of the meeting, yeah.
And Ethel was one of the founding members of this meeting and was very weighty at the time, but she was homesick. So Paul said, well, thank you, Magdalene. What canst thou say?
Oh, okay.
Who was
I'm with
not
you.
very mentally adroit woman, said, oh, I just don't think Ethel would approve of this. And then Paul said, yes, we hear that, Magdalene, but what is your position? And Magdalene once more said, I don't think Ethel would approve. And so Paul said, well, would you stand aside, Magdalene? And Magdalene said, oh, I just don't think Ethel would approve. And so Paul finally made the decision, Magdalene, I hear you say you are stepping aside. And with that, the minute was approved.
So just for anyone who's watching this who is unfamiliar, the sort of part of this, both the humor and the profundity of that is that what canst thou say is a famous sort of Quaker quote from, I believe, George Fox, saying like, or Margaret Fell. Margaret Fell quoting George Fox. Just like when people start getting away from their own experiences, and I think was like just quoting, well, you know, this book says this, and this Bible says this, and this authority says this, to say, what canst thou say? And there, and a good example too of using plain speech, what canst thou say? That is the thou form of English. And also this, that turning towards inward experience as opposed to towards outward authority. So this is perfect example of that used in the current age. I guess.
So there's this almost, it seems like dialectic tension between the community and the individual. And again, that anarchistic aspect it seems like this tension between those two things, you know, that we highly value.
We have been described as a disorganized religion.
Yeah, it's like I see this value of the individual and how the individual approaches things and is being led, but also the community as a whole.
Well, you know, as why don't use the right term? The sense. What's the sense of the meeting? You know, and I guess that's getting into talking about how we do business next time.
Yeah, it's tricky. This topic today just so easily blends into so many other things so quickly. It's I was speaking of that, just how are we organized then? There's this sort of tension between this deep individual leading and the community. Hopefully, ideally, it's not a bad tension, but a fruitful one, that the individuals sort of pull the community towards new ethical insights, new leadings, and the community hopefully tempers what might be perhaps not fully thought through or not fully reflected on or not fully true leadings of the individual, that there's sort of that constant, that they help each other in that way. That's sort of the ideal.
Would this be a good time, James, and you can tell me this is for another
Sure.
to talk about what happened through the long 18th century, you know, late 1600s to early 1800s with abolitionism, abolition of slavery, and how there was a tension between individuals and meetings there.
Oh,
Go
yeah.
for it.
So in 1688, and this is considered to be the first statement of any religious body against slavery. In 1688, the Germantown Friends meeting writes an epistle of concern to their yearly and quarterly meetings, saying they're opposed to slavery. You know, that's not, you know, that's, you know, for all the theological and other reasons you can think that people might say that. And because there were slave traders in the early Society of Friends, especially in the United States and in the colonies. And it took a while to get to the point where by probably the time of the American Revolution, that was one of the few things that would automatically get you kicked out of the Friends if you were engaged in the slave trade. But it was a lot of individuals working in their meetings. Probably two of the most, well, John Wollman is one we always talk about. John Wollman would do things like go around and hang out with slave owning Quakers. You know, he had a leading and he got support from his meeting, and then he traveled around and did this and just talk with them. You know, he wouldn't like, you know, exhort them or anything like that, but just talk with them and be with them. And it's reported that when he would leave some money. And he'd say, you know, you have these people that were waiting on me and helping me out and stuff like that. And I want, can you give them? But he would give it to the slave owner. He wouldn't give it to himself. He'd say, could you give this to them for me? And of course, you know, he was kind of creating that dissonance there. But he would do things like that, and this bears fruit. And by one of the very first things, and I actually dug this up in the archives, the first U.S. Congress that meets, one of the very first things they get petitions from Quakers out of Pennsylvania. Okay, what about this all of us are created equal thing? Let's get moving on this. Let's abolish slavery, you know. And so they'd gotten to that point by then. That's one way, you know, this drip working within the meeting, and gradually, I mean, it does become a movement, and we do, well, I mean, it wasn't exactly a peaceful transition, but we do get slavery abolished, and that was a part of it. But another model for that is a person called Benjamin Lay. I think there's a biography just came out of. Benjamin Lay was a Quaker, and he was a little more flamboyant. He would go and berate other Quakers, and he even did things like at one of the yearly meetings he came up, he had taken a Bible, hollowed it out, put mulberry juice inside, and then took the Bible and he squished it and all, it, came out like blood on one of the slaveholding Quakers. And he would, if he were offered a cup of tea, and he sensed that there was sugar in the tea, sugar was only produced by slavery, he would break the teacup.
Huh.
And he even apparently, at one point, kidnapped a slaveholding Quaker's child for a few days. Said, "See how it feels?" He was asked not to come to meeting at some point. But so there are different models of how this can work. There's the John Wollman model and there's the Benjamin Lay model. And there's a place for both.
Well put.
Yeah.
Huh.
About 11 years ago, my wife and I stayed for a week with a Quaker who has a house in Guatemala in Antigua there.
Mm.
And at the end of our stay, my wife left the maid the equivalent of a $20 tip. And our Quaker friend was very upset. She said, "Oh, don't do that. They'll get ideas about charge." I thought that was somewhat.
That sounds like a John Wollman moment.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
You made a good point about learning people's names. One thing I do remember going to the UU church, that they had somebody at the door when you came in with name tags with stickers, and so everybody either got a name tag, and the people that were regularly coming had their own, they could use every week, with their name on it. And they even got into the habit of putting their personal pronoun choices on there.
Thou or you.
Yes. And thou or you, him, or,
Yeah.
and I thought that was a kind of cool. And I think I've seen.
We
that.
actually have that same system, but we don't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two of us had them on today.
So.
Sort of do it.
I guess, one other sort of aspect I was sort of thinking about talking today and explaining just a big part of how our community functions. So there is this sort of at times seemingly sort of anarchic kind of feel of, but we have most of the work and most of the organization, I think, in addition to business meeting, happens in the form of committees. And so a lot of the sort of practical life of the meeting and the sort of how the lights stay on, how the building doesn't fall down, all these sort of things need to be attended to. And so one of the big ways that people contribute, as sort of Larry was talking about earlier, that sense of that you can contribute to the meeting is through serving on these committees. And there are quite a few. There are 14 committees. And we're in the process of sort of discussing 14 might be a bit too many. So we're sort of looking if we can sort of simplify that a bit. But in general, they all do really important work. So right now, this is being put on by the Adult Religious Education Committee, of which the members are myself, Mary, Howard, and then Hannah Vesh, who was here last time. So we sort of, our work is to help plan the forum hours before meetings, so that 10 a.m. time, and then also Quakerism 101. And then other sort of, we haven't done much besides that in recent years, but if there are other sort of adult educational things. Retreats, yeah, that has been something that's happened in years past. And then a whole bunch of others related to sort of the house and grounds as a committee. Community life sort of helps with the coffee and the cleanup and making sure that all of the sort of functions, often around eating of community, are maintained. And a number of others, peace and social concerns, which is slightly different, I guess, in that it's not sort of involved directly in internal affairs of the meeting, but is more sort of looking outwards towards social causes and peace more broadly in the world and how the meeting should be involved in that. Something you could say something sort of similar about community relations, which is also sort of outwardly focused, but more particularly to people in our immediate sort of community and how Friends Meeting of Austin can relate to them and be helpful and form good relationships with our neighbors. There are a number of others. There's a whole list online with descriptions. The two committees that they, of course, announce every time at the end of meeting for worship are worship and ministry, which is responsible for greeting people at the door, also having a person who closes meeting at the end is always, I think, a member of worship and ministry. And they're also responsible just for maintaining the worship life of the meeting and just continuing to hold that and to make sure that it goes in a good way. And then caring counsel, which is what the committee that has responsibility for clearness committees. We talked about a little bit that process of if you have a major life decision, coming to that. For instance, marriage is one of a great example, but also some major career or life transition that you can request a clearness committee for really anything. That, in addition to a support committee, and that's not necessarily around a decision or a life change, but just if you need some support from the community, if there's some time of difficulty and you want just people to talk to and that can try to help you in whatever way they can. That's something that Care and Counsel does, and that's all very confidential. And as is the benevolence fund that I was talking about earlier, that's something that we make available to the community, understood more broadly and not exclusive to members. And then of course, membership is also, that clearness process is also handled by Care and Counsel.
What about memorials?
That is, I think worship and ministry and Care and Counsel together usually do that. Memorials, that is a good question.
I think people, I think, go to Care and Counsel and worship and ministry kind of helps get it going. Yeah.
So these are the big sort of the structures that that allow it to work as an extremely sort of egalitarian, sort of equal society, and yet make sure that someone is always responsible for picking up the mail and you know, making sure that the air conditioning unit works and just keeping all the things going in this sort of more egalitarian form. Yeah, I guess I found serving on these committees very fulfilling and very joyful. So I'd encourage if you are curious about them, they definitely are always in need of people. Any further
Jim
thoughts
made
on that?
an announcement today about they're looking for volunteers to be on committees.
Mm-hmm. I guess that more or less covers the sort of structural features of how the community works that I was hoping to get towards today, sort of membership and committee structures and and just generally what type of community. Oh, I guess the last thing I maybe would want to say about our community nowadays in sort of contrast to what Friends were like in the 1700s or the 1800s is, as I was describing, it was very much, marked very clearly separate from the world. Went for marriage, plain dress. It was also, as I understand it, at least mostly, especially in the United States and Britain, a very much something passed down intergenerationally, so that the communities would develop. That many people were brought up as Quakers and would continue as Quakers. And there are definitely people still at the meeting who were brought up as Quakers, and they're sometimes referred to as birthright friends if they are brought up in the Quaker tradition. But for the most part, I'd say our communities nowadays are formed of people who come to Quakerism either teenagers or mostly I think as adults. And usually if you weren't brought up Quaker, and the majority then would be called convinced friends. And what that term convinced means, I guess kind of just what it sounds like, that you have been convinced of this. I heard it also has an origin in the sort of, and this seems a little archaic. It took me a while to think about this, but I heard that it was also related to sort of convincement and conviction. and convict in an almost sort of punitive sense that like, I've realized that that realization is not just of a joyful one, but also seeing one's life and the flaws therein, and that sort of moment of
Standing in the light.
standing in the light. Yeah, but that also is sort of an experience of being convicted as well as being convinced.
And the process, which I haven't heard the term used anywhere else, is convincement.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
my.
There is a
convincement-
great novel, not novel. There is a great memoir, I guess, by an Englishman which is called Quaker by Convincement.
So I guess before we move on, I guess I haven't left much time for the communal worship thought. But do people have any questions about just how the community works? We'll get to business meeting. That's a whole separate topic of how we make decisions together. But in terms of the structures of monthly, quarterly, yearly meetings, committees, membership.
So if you were to become a member and you have to write this letter, would that be part of it? Would be what is convincing you?
Why?
You don't have to put it in that
Member,
letter.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
Yeah. I think.
why you intend to be a member, and if you make it too brief, you'll probably get handed the letter back and be told to put a little more into it. I've been there.
My letter was extremely short. I think it just said to the clerk, I'm interested, I would like to explore becoming a member, and I request a clearness committee. I think that's all I said.
But see, I got one handed back to me, and it was that late. But it wasn't in Austin.
Okay.
I feel like those questions of convincement and stuff, even if you want to put them into a letter, that would be certainly welcome. But
Or how are you being led? Leading was another word that was used.
Just know the lingo.
Right.
Those things would also come out in the Clearness Committee that would follow upon that letter. So even if you didn't want to state all that at the outset, those would be sort of some of the questions that would definitely come up in the course of talking to the group. So I guess the final sort of query I had for people, this is actually much more closely related to what is in Rex Ambler's chapter on meeting with others, is although a lot of friends do have sort of personal, private religious practices or practices of worship that they do on their own, it is, and as I understand, always has been a really important part of our tradition and our way of worshiping is worshiping corporately or worshiping together in a group, and that is important. And I just would like to ask people sort of two questions. First, how are you aware of other people during meeting for worship? And then how is it different than to be in that sort of corporate worship as opposed to worshiping on your own?
Well, back in the day before pandemic, when we were actually meeting at the gathering corporately, I attended an interest session in which I think the guy identified himself as a historian, I'm not sure, but he had done a lot of research on early Quaker practice. And he said that the purpose of Quaker worship in the early days was to examine our faults and hold them in the light until they dissipated. And then in the meeting, one could rise and, I guess confess is probably the word, confess the faults that they had been examined and how life had changed for them now that the faults had disintegrated. So that had a big impact on me. I still remember it. it's remarkable because it reminds me very much of 12-step practice, where after you've gotten right with God, you then examine both your faults and your assets in a serious and moral inventory of them. And then you confess them to yourself, God, and another person.
And then you make amends.
And yeah, so I'm struck by that. And it also seems like in my own practice, early on, we don't do this anymore, but early on, discorporately, we would gather in the center of the meeting, and we would toss this golden globe around from one discorporate avatar of ourselves to another. We stopped doing that for some reason. I don't know why. But that seemed like, and for a while it was like, oh, balloon, I was kind of just doing it for the fun of it. But then I realized, oh, this is Quaker communion. This is what's happening here. And I kind of wish we could do that again. So that's what I got.
So you literally pass a.
No, we would toss it, but we would do it discorporately.
Oh, Discord. Okay, so you're not talking about literal.
Our avatars would pass this around. Yeah. Our discorporate avatars.
Okay. Okay.
It was like an imaginary golden ball.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
Or sphere of light or something.
Sorry, my mind is often too literal minded, and I actually did visualize it.
Well, I meant it literally.
After the meeting. Oh, it's a practice, but that's a beautiful. Yeah.
Speaking of individual practices or whatever, I've kind of been a student of A Course in Miracles in the last few years, and talks about this thing called holy relationships as opposed to special relationships. And special relationships are much more, ego based, and holy relationships are more when you have two or more people gathered together. Again, their purpose is something greater than themselves, and so there's this aspect of possibly service or something greater than the individual. And there's even a couple of lines in there about how the oneness of all of us, but also that we enter into heaven two by two, or not singly, but we enter together and so that's interesting that it's not just one gate that each of us individually walks through, that we are a corporate unity in a sense. And even spiritually, there is that aspect of oneness.
Too, I was just reflecting I feel like we're right now this question has been at the forefront of all of our minds for the last 2 years, just because, the idea of corporate, like in the body together, that's for all of Quaker history, really. I think that there might have been a few online worship meetings, but really, usually it has been in person, that this is, the way we meet together has changed just these last 2 years. And yeah, I'm curious, in addition to thinking about how meeting together is different from worshiping alone, we kept worshiping together even when we were physically separated. that was still something that we did and we continue to do. And it's something, yeah, what that is like is that, is how is that togetherness still important, or what does it still feel like? How much is it related to the body and the space, and how much is it related to seeing each other or being in intention together? I'm not sure.
There's a, I forget what part of that chapter of Amber's, Amber's chapter, where he talks about the importance for early Quakers of being face to face, because that's how you ground, the messages and the leadings that you get, because you're face to face and we're all actually looking at each other, and I think that's pretty profound.
I was pleasantly surprised to find that meeting on Zoom counts as face-to-face for me.
Yeah.
And if somebody never turns on their picture or is on the phone and they can't be on the picture, I miss that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the same as being in the same place at the same time, but it's a lot better than trying to do it on the telephone or saying, okay, we're all going to worship at 11 o'clock. Think about it.
The other cool thing I've noticed, it has been interesting to see people in their own environments, their own home environments, and see, that. But also some people, it seems like that on Zoom have attended from outdoors.
Yeah.
And that's always, interesting to see the, that interplay of being connected to their environment. And we're lucky that we have these big windows that we can see outside and see the, the greater environment. And so there's that whole, it'd be interesting to have a meeting outdoors sometime or something. So.
Interesting. I feel like in some ways in Zoom, it's even more face-to-face since I can look at someone else's face directly and hesitatingly, which in meeting for worship, I'm aware, but I usually, the sort of social I wonder if early friends meeting face-to-face, whether they would really stare at each other or whether, since I feel like that would be sort of potentially seem threatening to most people if you were to just stare at them. That I usually sort of have people in my more peripheral vision and sort of look at something. I was about to compare it to being in a subway, but I realized that's not but it's very different, but you're doing it together. You're still worshiping together with them, even if you're not looking at them directly. And how to hold their presence in me, even if as I don't necessarily look at them in the same way that I might be able. And Zoom solves that problem in a way, since you can just look at someone and I guess that's a little bit creepy. They don't know that you're but yeah, it does change how you can see each other.
There is an attender of this meeting who's pleased to come because he says that looking at Quakers on Zoom is like watching Quakers sleep. And if you think about that image, that's very intrusive. I mean, imagine yourself getting up in the middle of the night, going into someone's bedroom and watching them. That would be a violation. And of course, as it happens, this person was abused as a child and his parents disowned him, and he's very much out of touch with his feelings. And I gave away his gender, didn't I? Sorry. Anyway, this person is out of touch with their feelings because of the trauma as a child. And so life has to really kind of knock him up against the side of his head to get his attention. Because one time he had this impulse to go to Atlantic City.
Since this will be available online, I think we shouldn't give any more details about.
Oh my goodness, I would be giving it away.
I feel like it's good to just.
Oh, I didn't want to
try
do
to
that. Oh,
actually
thank you.
observe it.
Okay, I won't tell you the story then. But anyway, life sometimes has to hit you in the side of your head if you're not paying attention.
That's quite true.
That is an interesting question on how to be respectful of others. I guess history, trauma, there's all this talk these days, triggers and being respectful of, I guess, the individual and even pronouns and where that individual and their history and their background. Again, there's a dialectic tension between what's good for the group and what's good for the individual, and being respectful of those differences.
That's a good, I realize that we're just about 3 o'clock now, and as you may have heard, there is a piano recital coming to the space shortly after us. But I just want to thank everyone for coming today, either online and in person here. And our next session, as we kept alluding to, will be on a meeting for worship with attention to business and the Quaker means of coming to decisions, which is very special and something that is quite unlike, I think, how business is practiced really anywhere else. So that will be in 2 weeks' time from now, and Mary will be leading. Hopefully, maybe I do need to talk to Steve Dock, who's the current clerk of the meeting, but hopefully he'll also be able to help that. So anyway, thank you, friends.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.